If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. What do you do when the reason why you were pushed into the spotlight is gone? Especially when that spotlight was something that you didn't seek out for yourself. Do you retreat and live the rest of your life calmly and quietly? Or do you take that platform and continue to do good? Well, if you asked the subject of this week's episode, she would have said the latter. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 21st episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So, some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about Eleanor Roosevelt one more time. This is Eleanor Roosevelt Part 3. So there were 2 episodes that came before this one. And I recommend that you listen to those episodes first. But if you want to listen to the Eleanor Roosevelt episodes out of order, you do you. I will be recapping the first 2 episodes, but I'm not going to be able to recap every single detail. So here's the recap. Eleanor Roosevelt was born into a well-to-do family. She was the niece of the U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. She was orphaned before she reached adulthood. She married her 5th cousin once removed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin had an affair with Eleanor's secretary, Lucy Mercer. That changed their marriage. From then on out, their marriage was more like a political partnership. Eleanor fell in love with the female reporter, Lorena Hickok. She may have also fallen in love with Harry Hopkins and also her bodyguard, Earl Miller. Franklin became the 32nd president of the United States. Franklin also had other affairs, and Eleanor was aware of those affairs and she was okay with them. Eleanor was not a traditional first lady. She held press conferences and she voiced her opinions on things that mattered most to her. She was a big supporter of the civil rights movement. She spoke up for the cause even when people told her to shut up. Franklin died on April 12, 1945. And I ended last week's episode with telling you that I would tell you what Eleanor's life looked like after Franklin died. And that's what I'm going to do right now. If you think that Eleanor backed away from her causes just because her husband died and she was no longer the first lady, you would be wrong. Even though Bess Truman was now the first lady, Eleanor still had a platform that she could use, and she still had opinions that she wanted to express. Bess Truman did not keep the press conferences that Eleanor started. Bess was not outspoken like Eleanor was, and she believed that it was her duty as a wife to keep her opinions private. After Franklin's funeral, Eleanor returned to Valkill for a little bit. Then she moved around New York for the next several years. Franklin left instructions for Eleanor to give their residence in Hyde Park to the federal government and have it turned into a museum. Many thought that Eleanor would run for public office, but she did not. But like I said earlier, she did not disappear after Franklin died. In December of 1945, Harry S. Truman, he was the next president after Franklin, Harry asked Eleanor to serve as a U.S. delegate to the United Nations. She accepted. On April 12, 1946, exactly 1 year after Franklin's death, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum opened at Hyde Park. In 1946, Eleanor became the first recipient of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Brotherhood Award. The Roosevelt Institute says this award is given to individuals whose careers amplify President Roosevelt's extraordinary dedication to public service. That award would not be the only award Eleanor would receive. She received the Award of Merit of New York City Federation of Women's Club in 1948. In 1950, she was awarded the Four Freedoms Award. She also got the Irving Geist Foundation Award and the Prince Carl Medal in 1950. The Gallup's Most Admired Man and Woman poll of Americans started in 1948, and every year from 1948 to 1961, except for 1951, Eleanor was the most admired living woman. In 1951, Elizabeth Kennedy won the poll. In 1946, Eleanor became the first head of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. She also began to draft the Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor also initiated the creation of Americans for Democratic Action. That group focused on domestic social reform and resistance against Russia and the Cold War. In 1947, Eleanor supported the Morgenthau Plan. This was a plan to weaken Germany after World War II. It would have eliminated Germany's arms industry and removed or destroyed other key industries basic to military strength. This plan would have devastated Germany. The plan was never implemented. On September 28, 1948, Eleanor gave a speech in favor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an international document adopted by the United Nations that preserves the rights and freedoms of all humans. And our girl Eleanor played a big role in drafting that. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations on December 10th, 1948. And Eleanor was very hopeful that this document would push the world away from war, and that was something that was very important to Eleanor. Eleanor was also the first United States representative to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. She stayed on at that position until 1953. On May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. Eleanor threatened to resign from the United Nations if President Harry S. Truman did not recognize the State of Israel. He did. Eleanor received a lot of pressure from President Harry S. Truman and the Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, to launch a moral offensive against the USSR. She agreed. In September of 1948, she gave a keynote address in Paris. It was titled The Struggle for Human Rights. In 1948, Eleanor also was on a radio discussion program on ABC with her daughter Anna. If you remember when we ended last week's episode, Eleanor was upset with the fact that Anna knew that Franklin carried on with his affair with Lucy Mercer, and she didn't tell her mother. So it's nice to see that that didn't hurt Eleanor's relationship with her daughter too much. It's nice to see that they were able to move past that and they were still able to have a relationship. Because of Eleanor's work towards the civil rights movement, Eleanor was made an honorary member of Alpha Kappa Alpha in 1949. This is a historically black organization. In the 1940s, Eleanor was one of the first people to support the creation of a United Nations agency that specialized in the issues of food and nutrition. I said earlier that many thought that Eleanor would run for public office, but she did not. But that didn't mean that those that were running for public office didn't want to have her around. Eleanor was Democratic gold. Catholics made up a good proportion of the Democratic Party in New York City. Eleanor supported reformers trying to overthrow Tammany Hall. If you remember, I talked about Tammany Hall in one of the 3 episodes that I did on Alexander Hamilton earlier this season. If you don't remember me mentioning Tammany Hall, that is alright. This season has been longer than usual, and it feels like forever ago since I covered Alexander Hamilton. Tammany Hall was an American political organization. This organization helped Democrats get elected in New York, especially Irish immigrants. Most of these Irish immigrants were Catholics. So, because Eleanor was trying to overthrow Tammany Hall, some Catholics accused her of being anti-Catholic. Now, I didn't find anything to me that suggested that she was anti-Catholic. Now we know that she wasn't a friend to the Jewish community at first. I covered that in the first episode that I did on her. But she did learn from her mistakes, and she eventually became an ally to the Jewish community. So, personally, I don't get the vibe that she was anti-Catholic. Now, there was a cardinal that she got into a bitter feud with. His name was Francis Spellman. Francis called Eleanor anti-Catholic because in her column, My Day, remember My Day was a newspaper column where Eleanor voiced her opinions on things that mattered most to her. In My Day, Eleanor wrote that she did not support direct federal aid for religious schools. This feud was very public, and it lasted a month from July of 1949 to August of 1949. In 1950, Eleanor appeared on a TV and radio show on NBC with her son Elliot. So she kept herself in the public eye, but I don't get the sense that she did that for herself. She didn't do it to keep herself famous. Not that there's anything wrong with keeping yourself famous just so you can be famous, if that is what you want. That just wasn't Eleanor's thing. She kept herself in the public eye so she could do good, so she could draw attention to the causes she believed in. In 1950, Eleanor teamed up with Helen Ferris. Helen was the editor-in-chief of the Junior Literary Guide from 1929 to 1959. Eleanor co-wrote Partners, the United Nations and Youth with Helen. That won the Child Study Association of America's Children's Book Award. Now that award is called Bank Street Children's Book Committee's Josette Frank Award. I told you that many people wanted to attach themselves to Eleanor because she was Democratic gold. She supported Adlai Stevenson for president in 1952 and 1956. She even spoke at the Democratic National Convention in 1952 and 1956. And she wanted him to be renominated in 1960. If you don't know, there has never been a President Stevenson. So just because she backed someone didn't mean they would win. Dwight D. Eisenhower won the election. When Dwight became president, Eleanor resigned from her United Nations post in 1953. When John F. Kennedy ran for president, Eleanor backed him, and he did win. John reappointed her to the United Nations from 1961 to 1962. He also appointed her to the National Advisory Committee of the Peace Corps. So, I told you earlier that Eleanor had issues with Tammany Hall. Well, in 1954, Tammany Hall boss Carmine DeSapio defeated Eleanor's son, Franklin Jr., in the election for New York Attorney General. Eleanor did not like Carmine. He had alleged involvement with organized crime. So, to me, I feel like that was why she was against Tammany Hall, and it had nothing to do with her being anti-Catholic. Eleanor hated Carmine so much that she was disappointed in President Harry S. Truman when he backed New York Governor W. Averill Harriman because he was a close associate of Carmine's. The civil rights movement wasn't the only cause that Eleanor was passionate about. Fighting world hunger was also very important to her. She worked with Frederick L. McDougall, an Australian nutritionist, and they pushed the United Nations program into creating the Food from Hunger campaign. The campaign mobilized non-governmental organizations against hunger and malnutrition in the world. In 1957, Eleanor visited the Soviet Union as a representative of the New York Post, and she met with Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita was the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Civil Rights Act was also passed by Congress in 1957. In 1958, Eleanor spoke at Highlander Folk School in Tennessee about civil rights, even though she got threats from the KKK. Eleanor didn't let the KKK's threats stop her from speaking up. At the school, Eleanor spoke about voting restrictions in the South. Eleanor was shown a list of questions that were frequently asked of people during their interviews to obtain registration, and Eleanor could see right through the bullshit. She felt that those questions were made to keep people from voting. This is what Eleanor wrote in My Day about it, quote, "In the application in South Carolina, for instance, you must state what race you belong to and swear to certain things which were quite astonishing to me. For instance, I thought we had long ago done away with a property qualification for voting, yet one of the things that you must swear to is, I own and have paid all taxes due last year on property in this state assessed at $300 or more. You must also swear to the statement, "I will demonstrate to the registration board that I can both read and write a section of the Constitution of South Carolina." Further, you must swear that I am not an idiot or insane, a pauper supported at public expense, or confined in any public prison. It seems fairly obvious that if you were confined in a public prison, you would not be there applying for registration. And who knows if any of us are insane. End quote. Not only was Eleanor brave and smart, but she was also a little snarky. That's a great combination. She also said something in her column about this event that I want to share with you. Quote, "This school, because it does hold integrated meetings and frequently the workshops are on labor problems, has often been accused of being communist. I saw no evidence that suggested communist influence, but I thought these were courageous people attempting to show that we could do here at home what we are trying to do in the world, namely to live together in peace regardless of race or creed. It is sad that we still use the label of communist for anything we dislike or do not understand." End quote. Encampment for Citizenship is a nonprofit organization that conducts residential summer programs with year-round follow-up for young people. Eleanor held encampment workshops at her home in Hyde Park. People claimed that it was socialism, but Eleanor defended it. In the 1950s, Eleanor became a spokeswoman for women. This made her stop criticizing the Equal Rights Amendment. Even though she stopped criticizing it, she never supported it. The Equal Rights Amendment was written by Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman. They were two suffragists. Many that opposed the Equal Rights Amendment feared what the amendment would do to traditional gender roles. They argued things like it would make women subject to conscription, and women wouldn't be able to get alimony, and there would be single-sex bathrooms, things like that. Though by the early 1960s, Eleanor no longer saw the Equal Rights Amendment as a threat to women. She even told the supporters that they could have the amendment if they wanted it. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy's Undersecretary of Labor, Esther Peterson, proposed a new presidential commission on the status of women. John F. Kennedy appointed Eleanor to chair the commission. While Eleanor never lived to see the commission issue their report, it was concluded by the commission that female equality was best achieved by recognizing the gender differences and needs and not by the Equal Rights Amendment. Fidel Castro is a name that you have probably heard of before. If you haven't, Fidel was a really evil dude that overthrew the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. After that, the relationship between the United States and Cuba went sour. President Dwight D. Eisenhower cut off sugar purchases from Cuba and placed an embargo on all exports to Cuba except for food and medicine. He did that because, like I said, Fidel was a really bad dude. Fidel confiscated private property, and he sent agents to initiate revolutions in several Latin American countries, and he formed ties with socialist powers. The CIA started to plan an invasion of Cuba in May of 1960. By April 15th, 1961, John F. Kennedy was the President of the United States. And on April 15th, 1961, 3 U.S.-made airplanes piloted by Cubans bombed Cuban air bases. These pilots were trained by the United States, and they were using American equipment. 2 days later, those pilots landed at several sites. The principal landing took place at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion force was no match for Fidel's troops. By April 19th, its last stronghold had been captured along with more than 1,100 men. The captured members of the invasion force were imprisoned. President John F. Kennedy asked Eleanor, Walter Reuther, and Milton S. Eisenhower, he was President Dwight D. Eisenhower's brother, John F. Kennedy asked them to negotiate the release of the captured Americans. This committee, that was headed by Eleanor, was called the Tractors for Freedom Committee. From May of 1961, the Kennedy administration unofficially backed attempts to ransom the prisoners. The committee failed to raise the $28 million needed for heavy construction equipment demanded by Fidel as reparations. The conditions for ransom changed several times during the next several months. Fidel finally agreed to let the prisoners go after James B. Donovan, he was a political negotiator, he negotiated the release of the prisoners in exchange for $53 million. Between December of 1962 and July of 1965, the survivors were returned to the United States. In 1962, Eleanor spearheaded a commission of inquiry into the administration of justice in the freedom struggle. She monitored and reported on the efforts and progress of the fight for civil rights in the United States. In April of 1960, Eleanor was struck by a car in New York City. Soon after that, Eleanor was diagnosed with aplastic anemia. In 1962, she was given steroids. The steroids activated a dormant case of tuberculosis in her bone marrow. The tuberculosis resulted in cardiac failure. She died on November 7, 1962, at her home in Manhattan. She was 78 years old. President John F. Kennedy ordered all U.S. flags lowered to half-staff throughout the world on November 8th in tribute to Eleanor. Eleanor's funeral was held 2 days later in Hyde Park. She was interred next to Franklin in the Rose Garden at Springwood Estate. That was the Roosevelt family home. Her funeral was attended by President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, and also by former Presidents Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eleanor's retreat at Valkill was preserved as the Eleanor Roosevelt National Historic Site. The family vacation home was deeded to the United States and Canadian governments in 1964, and it was turned into the Roosevelt Campobello International Park. The Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial on the National Mall is the only United States presidential memorial that depicts a First Lady. The statue of Eleanor is displayed with a likeness of the United Nations seal. The United Nations posthumously awarded Eleanor human rights prizes in 1968. Eleanor published 27 books. All the books that are available on Bookshop, I will put on a list, so in case you want to buy any of the books, you can. And if you click on the Bookshop link in the show notes, it helps support the podcast. Eleanor's portrait is hanging in the Vermeer Room of the White House. In 1973, Eleanor was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. In 1989, the Eleanor Roosevelt Fund Award was founded. It honors an individual, project, organization, or institute for outstanding contributions to equality and education for women and girls. There is a monument of Eleanor in New York's Riverside Park. In 1998, President Bill Clinton established the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights. In 1999, Eleanor came in 9th place on Gallup's list of most widely admired people of the 20th century. In 2001, the Eleanor Roosevelt Legacy Committee was founded by Judith Hollingsworth Hope. It supports pro-choice Democratic women that run for local and state offices in New York. In 2007, Eleanor was named a hero by the My Hero Project. Eleanor appears on a redesigned $5 US bill. She is also on a quarter. In 2020, Time magazine included Eleanor on its list of 100 Women of the Year, and she was retroactively named Woman of the Year for 1948. There have been schools named after Eleanor. One was a historically black school. That school was Eleanor Roosevelt, also known as Eleanor Roosevelt Vocational School for Colored Youth, Warm Springs Negro School, and the Eleanor Roosevelt Rosenwald School. There is also an Eleanor Roosevelt College. It is one of the 8 undergraduate residential colleges at the University of California in San Diego. There is also a small public high school called Eleanor Roosevelt High School in Manhattan, and there is a high school in Eastville, California that's also called Eleanor Roosevelt High School. Sunrise at Campobello is a play written by Dor Shari that is about Franklin's polio. That, of course, has Eleanor in it. There was a documentary about Eleanor in 1965 called The Eleanor Roosevelt Story. It won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. There was a historical play written by Arlene Stad titled Eleanor. There have been miniseries about Eleanor. There was Eleanor and Franklin, The White House Years, FDR, and Backstairs at the White House. That last one was based on a book by Lillian Rogers Parks titled My 30 Years Backstairs at the White House. Barbara Cooney published a children's picture book titled Eleanor. Gore Vidal wrote a novel titled The Golden Age. Eleanor is a character in that book. FDR, American Badass, is a spoof film about Franklin's life. In 2014, there was a documentary series titled The Roosevelts, An Intimate History. Eleanor is a character in the musical Clinton, the musical. The film Dear Eleanor is about 2 friends that travel across the United States in 1962 to meet their childhood hero, Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor was also featured in the series The First Lady. And that was the life of Eleanor Roosevelt. Thank you so much for listening to the 21st episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. And if you listened to all 3 of Eleanor Roosevelt's episodes, thank you. I am going to be covering 15 people this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Lucy Hicks Anderson. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter/X is at History Shelf Podcast, and the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of that episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month, and with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month, and with that you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the Zippa Putty. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. You can also click on one of the affiliated links. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch or any of the perks and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I've turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode.